In the quiet hills of Tennessee, where morning mist clings to forgotten farms, a widow's peaceful life is about to erupt in flames. Sarah Mitchell traded her tactical gear for gardening tools years ago, hoping to leave behind the shadow operations that made her one of the most feared Navy SEALs in modern history. Her call sign was Wraith, a ghost that moved through enemy lines like a whisper in the dark. But when the bikers called Demon Riders, MC reduces her farm to ashes, thinking they've found an easy target. They've just awakened a predator they never saw coming. This isn't just another revenge tale. This is the story of how America's deadliest motorcycle gang discovered that their biggest mistake wasn't burning down a widow's farm. It was not knowing that some warriors never truly leave the battlefield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning dew settled heavy on Sarah Mitchell's boots as she walked the perimeter of her farm, an old habit she couldn't shake even after 5 years of civilian life. The sun hadn't yet crested the Tennessee hills, but she'd already been up for hours, checking fence lines and feeding livestock with the same precision she once applied to mission planning in combat zones. Her hands, once skilled at assembling weapons blindfolded, now gently cradled fresh eggs from the henhouse. Each morning routine was a conscious choice, a step further from the woman she used to be. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, Navy SEAL, one of the first women to complete Bud-S training and earn her trident. Now she was just Sarah, the widow who ran Pleasant Valley Farm, known for her organic produce and prize-winning tomatoes at the county fair. Sheriff Tom Parker's patrol car kicked up dust as it rolled down her gravel driveway, right on schedule for his weekly check-in. He'd been Jack's best friend before the accident, and now he took it upon himself to keep an eye on her. She appreciated the gesture, even if she was more capable of handling trouble than he'd ever know. "Morning, Sarah," Tom called out, climbing from his cruiser with 2 cups of coffee from May's diner. "Thought you might need this after chasing off those coyotes I heard last night." Sarah accepted the coffee with a smile, not bothering to tell him there hadn't been any coyotes, just her, running her monthly security checks, keeping her skills sharp in the darkness. Some habits weren't meant to be broken, just hidden. "You're too good to me, Tom. Jack would haunt me if I wasn't." His face grew serious as he leaned against his car. "Heard anything from those bikers that passed through last week? Been getting reports about them causing trouble over in Robertson County." Sarah shook her head, remembering the leather-clad figures that had roared past her property, their motorcycles breaking the morning peace. "Nothing since then. They're not local. Demon Riders MC. They've been pushing east from Memphis, buying up properties, running protection rackets. Nothing we can pin on them yet." Tom's fingers drummed against his coffee cup. "Just keep your eyes open, Sarah. They've been targeting isolated properties, and you're out here all alone." The corner of her mouth twitched slightly. Alone, yes, but far from helpless. Still, she nodded like any concerned citizen would. "I'll call if I see anything suspicious." After Tom left, Sarah went about her day, tending to her vegetables and checking on her solar panels. Another habit from her. Past life, always ensuring multiple power sources. As she worked, her mind drifted to the cache buried beneath her tool shed, untouched since she'd moved here. Inside that waterproof case lay the tools of her former trade, weapons, tactical gear, encrypted communications equipment. Just in case, she'd told herself when burying it. Just in case the world found her again. The afternoon sun found her in Jack's old workshop, where she taught local kids basic self-defense twice a week. Parents thought she'd learned it from Jack, a former Marine. They didn't know she'd been the one teaching him advanced combat techniques during their marriage. Today's class was cancelled. The kids were away at a school football game, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the fading photographs on the walls. One picture caught her eye, her and Jack on their wedding day, his marine dress blues matching her Navy uniform. They'd been quite a pair, serving their country from different branches, understanding the weight of secrets they could never share. His death 3 years ago, a simple car accident of all things, had nearly broken her. The farm had saved her, giving her purpose, a place to heal. As the day wound down, Sarah sat on her porch, cleaning fresh vegetables for tomorrow's farmer's market. From here, she could see the whole valley, note every vehicle that passed on the main road, catalogue every change in the usual pattern of life. Peace didn't mean letting your guard down. That was another lesson she'd learned the hard way. The bell above May's general store chimed as Sarah pushed through the door, her weekly shopping list in hand. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh-baked bread stopped abruptly as she noticed the tension in the air. May stood behind the counter, her usually cheerful face drawn tight as she watched 3 leather-clad men browsing the aisles, demon riders. Their patches were clearly visible on their backs, a grinning demon clutching a burning chain. The largest one, a bear of a man with a greying beard, noticed Sarah and smiled. There was nothing friendly in that expression. "Well, look what we got here, boys. Another local farmer come to shop." His voice carried the false sweetness of a predator playing with its food. "I'm Buck. My friends and I are new to the area. Always good to meet the neighbors." Sarah kept her posture relaxed, maintaining the persona of a simple widow as she selected her items. "Welcome to Pleasant Valley." Her voice was neutral, but her mind was already cataloguing details, their weapons, concealed poorly under their jackets, their positions in the store, tactical spacing, military trained, their attention patterns, watching exits, experienced. "Funny thing about Pleasant Valley," Buck continued, moving closer. "Lots of nice, isolated properties. Perfect for expansion opportunities. You wouldn't happen to know anyone looking to sell, would you?" May's hands trembled slightly as she rang up Sarah's purchases. 2 more bikers had entered the store, positioning themselves near the door. Sarah recognized the tactic. Control the exit, create pressure. "Can't say that I do," Sarah replied, counting out exact change. "Most folks around here are pretty attached to their land." Buck's smile faded slightly. "That's too bad. See, when we find properties we like, we usually get them, one way or another." He picked up an apple from the display, tossing it between his hands. "Things can get real dangerous in the country. Fires, accidents, all sorts of bad luck can happen to stubborn folks." Sarah met his gaze, allowing herself one small moment of her true self to surface. Something in her eyes made Buck take a half step back before he caught himself. "Yes," she said softly, "bad luck does seem to find some people." The tension broke as Sheriff Tom's patrol car pulled into the parking lot. Buck and his men casually dispersed, filing out the back door of the store. As they left, Buck turned back. "Think about what I said, Mom. We'll be around." Later that evening, Tom stopped by her farm again, his face grim. "They hit the Anderson place last night, broke John's arm when he refused to sell. His wife's. Too scared to press charges." Sarah continued washing her produce, her movements methodical. "How many in their group?" 20, maybe 30 core members. Got a compound they're setting up just over the county line." Tom ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I've called the state police, FBI. Nobody wants to touch it. These guys have connections, Sarah. Political protection. You're worried about my farm." "Damn right I am. After what happened at May's today, they're going to come for you. They always pick isolated targets first, wear down the community's resistance." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Maybe you should consider selling. I know Jack loved this place, but he'd want you safe." Sarah dried her hands slowly, remembering the weight of her rifle, the feel of her tactical gear. "I appreciate the concern, Tom, but this is my home. I'm not going anywhere." After Tom left, Sarah walked to her tool shed. The padlock clicked open, and she moved aside her gardening equipment to reveal a trapdoor concealed beneath years of dirt and use. The cache was exactly as she'd left it. Weapons, ammunition, communications gear, everything a ghost would. Need to wage war. She didn't open the cases. Not yet, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think like an operator again, analyzing threats, calculating responses, planning contingencies. The Demon Riders had made a crucial mistake. Today, they'd revealed their tactics, their numbers, their training level. They thought they were hunters. They didn't realize they were playing at war with someone who had mastered it in the darkest corners of the world. Sarah closed the tool shed, locking away both her weapons and her decisions for another day. But as she walked back to her house, under the setting sun, her steps had changed, silent, purposeful, deadly. The widow was starting to remember the warrior. Dawn painted the farmhouse in shades of gold as Sarah completed her morning routine, each motion a practiced dance between her old life and new. The coffee pot burbled in the kitchen while she moved through a series of stretches. Not the simple exercises her neighbors might recognize, but the complex warm-up routine of a Spec Ops veteran, keeping her body combat-ready. Her mind drifted to Bud's training as she worked, remembering the instructor's words during Hell Week. The calm is where you prepare. The storm is where you prove. She'd lived by those words, through dozens of missions, through loss and victory, through the death of her husband and the building of her new life. The morning news droned in the background. Another local business, mysteriously burned down after refusing to pay for protection. The Demon Riders were getting bolder, their territory expanding like a cancer across 3 counties. Sarah noted the pattern. First the threats, then the accidents, finally the fires. They were systematic, professional, military training. She'd bet her life on it. A familiar rumble caught her attention, motorcycles on the main road just beyond her property line. 3rd time this week. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore, marking their targets with slow drive-bys and intimidation tactics. Sarah continued her garden work, appearing oblivious while counting bikes, noting times, identifying recurring faces. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Jack would have said. She could almost hear his voice, see him leaning against the porch railing in his favorite USMC shirt. He'd always worried about her, even knowing what she was capable of. Their love had been built on mutual understanding of duty, of sacrifice, of the weight that warriors carry even in peacetime. The memory of him sparked another. A mission. In South America, her team tracking a cartel through remote jungle. They'd used the same tactics these bikers were employing: intimidation, corruption, fear. But cartels like these bikers had a fatal flaw. They never expected their victims to fight back. Not really, not effectively. Sarah checked her security. Cameras, carefully hidden in birdhouses and trees around the property, noting the increased traffic on the back roads. The Demon Riders were setting up supply lines, establishing dominance over transport routes. Their compound might be over the county line, but their operations were spreading like fingers closing into a fist. Inside her basement, behind a false wall of preserves and canned vegetables, Sarah kept her intelligence center, small, efficient, off-grid. Here she maintained her maps, tracking gang movements, noting patterns, building a picture of their organization. Old habits died hard, and intelligence gathering had always been her specialty. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, May from the general store, her eyes red from crying. "They killed Mr. Whiskers," she said without preamble. "My cat. Left him on my doorstep this morning. Said it was a warning about their protection fees going up." Sarah made tea, listening as May poured out her fears. The whole town was changing, falling under the shadow of leather and chrome. The sheriff's office was overwhelmed, corrupted, or both. People were selling their homes for pennies, fleeing before the violence got worse. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," May whispered. My store's been in my family for 3 generations. I can't just leave, but I'm scared. Sometimes, Sarah replied carefully, the best thing to do is wait. Watch. Let them think they've won. Every predator gets careless when they think their prey is helpless. After May left, Sarah noticed more bikes passing by. Their engines seemed louder, more aggressive, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. Through her kitchen window, she watched a group of them stop at her property line. One rider, she recognized Buck's massive frame, pointed toward her house, making crude gestures to his laughing companions. In her bedroom closet, behind a rack of sundresses, Sarah's fingers found the hidden seam that concealed her most important keepsake, a small wooden box containing her Navy SEAL trident. She hadn't opened it since Jack's funeral, hadn't needed the reminder of who she was, what she could do. Tonight, she opened it. The gold eagle and trident caught the last rays of sunset, throwing shadows across her wall. Outside, more motorcycles roared past, their thunder a promise of violence to come. But Sarah sat quietly, holding her badge of honor, remembering the oath she'd taken, to protect, to defend. Some storms she knew were meant to be faced head-on. The first Molotov cocktail crashed through Sarah's kitchen window at 2:17 a.m. She was already moving before the glass shattered, muscle memory from countless operations guiding her through the darkness. The second firebomb hit the barn, followed by the harsh laughter of men who thought they were unleashing hell but had no idea what hell truly was. Flames licked up the vintage wallpaper Jack had loved so much as Sarah grabbed her go-bag from behind the pantry wall. More bottles of burning gasoline sailed through windows, methodically targeting every exit. These weren't amateur thugs. This was a professional operation. They'd cut her landline first. Cell signals were already being jammed. The demon riders had done this before. Through the smoke, Sarah caught glimpses of them, 12 men in formation covering all angles. The crack of gunfire punctuated the roar of the flames as they shot out her tires, eliminating escape routes. They weren't just burning her out, they were enjoying it, savoring what they thought was a helpless woman's terror. "Burn, bitch," Buck's voice carried over the inferno. "Should have sold when you had the chance." Sarah moved like a ghost through her burning home, staying low, gathering what couldn't be replaced: Jack's photo, her trident, a handful of essential documents. The heat was becoming unbearable, but she forced herself to stay focused, to think. Tactically, they'd expect her to run out the front or back. That's where their guns were trained. They didn't know about the storm cellar's tunnel. Jack had thought she was being paranoid when she'd insisted on installing the escape route. "Honey, this isn't Baghdad," he'd said. But he'd helped her dig it anyway, understanding that peace didn't mean surrendering preparation. More bottles crashed through windows as Sarah slipped into the hidden entrance behind the water heater. The tunnel would take her out past the tree line. From there she could circle back, observe, gather intelligence, start planning. Through the cellar's ventilation slits, she heard Buck ordering his men to maintain their positions. "Watch for movement. Nobody survives this message." A pause, then, "Miller, Jenkins, check the barn. Make sure her equipment burns." Sarah allowed herself one last look through the slits at her home, her peaceful life, being consumed by flames. The garden she'd tended so carefully, the workshop where she'd taught local kids to defend themselves, the porch where she and Jack had planned their future. All of it sacrificed to men who mistook kindness for weakness. The tunnel was narrow, designed for one person moving fast. Sarah crawled through it with practiced efficiency, her mind already shifting from civilian to operator. She catalogued resources, weapons cache in the tool shed, if it hadn't burned, contacts from her old life, surveillance footage backed up to a secure server. Most importantly, the demon riders had just shown her their tactics, their numbers, their level of training. They thought they were starting a fight. They didn't realize they were starting a war. The tunnel's exit was concealed beneath a fallen log 200 yards into the woods. Sarah emerged into the cool night air, immediately taking cover and beginning her visual survey. The fire had attracted attention. She could hear sirens in the distance. Too late to save her home, but the response would force the riders to withdraw soon. Buck's voice carried through the trees. Mount up, remember, official story is electrical fire. Any witnesses say different, they join the widow. The roar of motorcycles filled the night as Sarah watched her farm collapse in on itself, the main beam of the house finally giving way in a shower of sparks. In the distance, red and blue lights began painting the sky. She stayed motionless, controlling her breathing, pushing down the rage that threatened to overwhelm her tactical judgment. There would be time for anger later. Right now, she needed to think like the warrior she'd never stopped being. The demon riders had just made two critical mistakes. They'd assumed she died in the fire, and they'd given her nothing left to lose. As emergency vehicles began arriving at her burning property, Sarah Mitchell, widow, farmer, former Navy SEAL, melted deeper into the darkness. The time for playing defense was over. Now she would hunt. Dawn painted the smoking ruins of Pleasant Valley Farm in shades of grey and black. Sarah watched from the tree line as firefighters dampened the last hot spots, their movements punctuated by the flash of police cameras. Sheriff Tom stood among the ashes of her home, his face a mask of helpless rage as he argued with the fire marshal. "Electrical fire, my ass!" His voice carried across the destruction. "This was deliberate, and we all know who did it." The fire marshal, a new face, probably bought and paid for, shook his head. No evidence of accelerants. Old wiring in these farmhouses. It was bound to happen sooner or later. Just be grateful the owner wasn't home. Sarah's lip curled slightly. They'd done this before. Corrupted officials, falsified reports. A perfect system of terror and control. Her tactical watch showed 5:47 a.m. Time to move. The tool shed, by some miracle or oversight, had survived the inferno. Sarah circled through the woods, using the skills that had earned her the call sign Wraith to approach unseen. The cache remained untouched beneath the trapdoor, waterproof cases containing the tools of her former trade. As she retrieved them, her fingers moved across familiar shapes, her modified M4, night vision equipment, tactical gear, old friends she'd hoped never to need again. A branch snapped behind her. Sarah spun, muscle memory bringing her into a defensive stance, but it was only Tom. His eyes widened at the arsenal spread before her. "Jesus Christ, Sarah," he whispered. "What? Who are you?" "Someone who's done hiding." She continued checking her equipment. "How compromised is the department?" Tom's shoulders sagged. "Deep, new captains in their pocket. State police won't touch it. Too many politicians got campaign contributions from shell companies I'm betting trace back to the riders." He paused. "But I've got 3 deputies I trust. Good men, tired of watching these bastards destroy our community. Keep them clear of what's coming." Sarah's voice was steel. "This isn't your fight. Like hell it's not. They tried to kill you, Sarah. They've terrorized this whole county, and I can't—" "Tom?" She faced him fully. "What I'm about to do, it's better if you maintain deniability. Trust me." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "My God," Jack used to say. He said, "You were more than just Navy, that you'd done things that never happened in places that don't exist." Sarah sealed her cases. "I need you to do something for me. Keep monitoring their channels, but don't engage. If anyone asks, you tried to convince me to stay with relatives after the fire, but I refused all contact. They'll figure out you survived eventually. By then, it'll be too late." Sarah spent the next hours systematically preparing, her satellite phone connected to numbers that hadn't been dialed in years, old teammates, ghosts like her, who lived in the shadows between military and civilian life. No one asked questions. They understood. Sometimes the war follows you home, equipment cached in strategic locations, surveillance devices planted, digital intrusion into the Demon Rider's communications begun. Sarah moved through it all with mechanical precision, but inside, something was changing. The facade of the simple widow was burning away, revealing the steel underneath. By sunset, she'd established a new base in an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the hills. Her laptops hummed with intercepted communications, building a picture of the Riders' operation. Their compound housed 32 members, 6 on guard at any time, regular shipments of drugs and weapons, political protection bought with blood money. Sarah studied the data with cold efficiency, already forming plans. The Riders had demonstrated their playbook: intimidation, corruption, violence. But they'd never faced an enemy trained in asymmetric warfare, someone who could turn their own tactics against them. In the growing darkness, she opened one final case. Inside lay her combat uniform, still bearing the traces of her last mission 5 years ago. As she checked each piece of gear, Sarah remembered the words of her first commanding officer. "A SEAL's greatest weapon isn't their rifle or their training. It's their patience, their ability to wait for the perfect moment to strike." The Demon Riders thought they'd eliminated a threat. Instead, they'd awakened something far deadlier. A predator who moved like a ghost, struck like lightning, and never left witnesses. They wanted to play with fire. She would show them what it meant to burn. The Demon Riders' compound sprawled across 10 acres of former farmland, ringed by security cameras and floodlights. From her observation post half a mile away, Sarah watched their patterns through her scope, noting guard rotations and blind spots. 3 days of surveillance had confirmed her initial assessment. These weren't just thugs on bikes. Their security showed military precision. Ex-military, she muttered, making another note in her weatherproof tactical notebook. Probably dishonorably discharged. The theory explained their level of organization, their tactical awareness. It also meant they'd be harder to break than typical gang members. Sarah's burner phone vibrated, a text from one of her old contacts. Charlie had been her team's supply specialist during multiple classified operations. Now he consulted for private security firms, no questions asked. Package ready. Usual dead drop. The dead drop was an abandoned gas station 20 miles north. Sarah found the heavy duffel bag exactly where Charlie had promised, containing everything she'd requested: specialized ammunition, encrypted communications gear, and enough semtex to remind the Riders why they should have stayed in Memphis. Back at her cabin, Sarah began preparing her equipment with methodical precision. Each piece of gear was checked, rechecked, and positioned for quick access. The wall displayed her intelligence gathering, surveillance photos, communication intercepts, patrol schedules. The Riders' operation was extensive, but followed predictable patterns. Their supply lines ran through 3 main routes. Their protection racket targeted specific types of businesses, ones that dealt primarily in cash. Most importantly, they maintained their power through a network of corrupted officials, all traced back to a single source: Judge Michael Reynolds. Sarah's laptop chirped. One of her surveillance algorithms had picked up chatter. A new shipment was coming in tonight. 3 trucks, heavily guarded. The Riders were expanding their operation, pushing into new territory. "Time to introduce some chaos into their system," Sarah murmured, checking her tactical gear. Her old uniform felt like a second skin, each piece of equipment exactly where muscle memory expected it to be. The weight of her modified M4 was familiar, comforting, a tool she'd hoped never to need again, but had never forgotten how to use. As dusk approached, she moved through the woods like a shadow, positioning herself along their supply route. The first truck would pass this point in exactly 17 minutes. Sarah set her charges with practiced efficiency, not to destroy, but to disable. This wasn't about killing. Not yet. This was about creating doubt, disrupting their confidence. Right on schedule, the convoy appeared. Sarah watched through her night vision as the lead truck hit her trap. Metal screamed as the vehicle's front axle sheared clean off, sending it into a controlled slide. The following trucks slammed on their brakes as armed riders spilled out of escort vehicles, shouting commands and scanning the trees. But Sarah was already gone, moving to her next position. As the riders secured their perimeter, she triggered her second surprise, carefully placed speakers broadcasting the sounds of movement from multiple directions. A basic psyops technique, but effective. The riders' formation began to break as they chased phantoms in the darkness. From her new vantage point, Sarah documented everything. Their response times, their command structure, the way they defaulted to military tactics under pressure. Most importantly, she identified their leader on scene, a tall man with a distinctive scar directing operations via radio. By morning, the demon riders would find their cargo scattered across 3 counties, their trucks disabled, and their reputation for invincibility showing its first cracks. They'd spend days trying to figure out who hit them, looking for a rival gang or federal task force. They wouldn't be looking for a ghost. Sarah packed her gear and melted into the pre-dawn darkness, already planning her next move. The riders had built their empire on fear. Fear of their strength, fear of their connections, fear of their retribution, but they were about to learn a hard lesson about fear. Sometimes the thing you should fear most is the prey you thought you'd already killed. Buck's right-hand man, Miller, lived alone in a double-wide trailer at the edge of town. Sarah had watched him for 3 days, learning his routines. He was the one who'd thrown the first Molotov through her window, laughing as her life went up in flames. Now, sitting in the darkness of his kitchen, she waited for him to return from the compound. Her fingers traced the grip of her suppressed MK-23, a ghost gun for a ghost's work. The weapon felt heavy with purpose, with the weight of a line she was about to cross. In war, killing had been clear-cut, sanctioned. This was different, personal. Headlights swept across the trailer's walls as Miller's motorcycle rumbled into the driveway. Sarah remained motionless, controlling her breathing, pushing down the memory of flames consuming Jack's photos. This wasn't about revenge, she reminded herself. This was about dismantling a threat, piece by piece. Miller stumbled through the door, reeking of whiskey and cigarettes. He flipped on the kitchen light and froze, registering the silenced barrel aimed at his chest. "You're dead," he whispered. "We burned you out. You tried." Sarah's voice was ice. "Sit down, slowly." He complied, eyes darting between her weapon and the tactical gear that marked her as something far more dangerous than a simple widow. "Listen, we can make a deal. I've got money, connections. How many? What? How many homes have you burned? How many lives have you destroyed?" Sarah leaned forward, letting him see her eyes. "I've watched you, Miller. You're their enforcer, the one who makes examples of people who don't pay up." Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Just following orders. Buck's the one you want. I can help. You get to him. I already know how to get to Buck. What I want to know is if you remember them. The Anderson family. May from the store. My farm. Do you remember laughing while people's lives burned?" Miller's hand inched toward the gun at his back. Sarah saw the movement coming, saw the exact moment survival instinct overcame fear. As he drew, she was already moving. 2 shots, precisely. He placed. Miller slumped forward, eyes wide with the revelation that all his tough guy posturing meant nothing against a true professional. Sarah caught him before he hit the table, preventing noise. "I remember," she whispered to his unhearing ears. The evidence was planted methodically. A drug stash she'd stolen from one of their warehouses, cash taken from a rival gang, a burner phone with incriminating texts suggesting Miller had been skimming profits, planning to run. By morning, the demon riders would find their enforcer. Dead, in what looked like a botched betrayal. Sarah worked efficiently, her movements precise, but her hands shook slightly as she finished. This wasn't a mission sanctioned by command. This was her choosing to become death again. The weight of that choice pressed against her chest like a physical thing. In her ear, she could almost hear Jack's voice. Sometimes the hardest choices are the right ones, honey. Sometimes you have to become what you fear to protect what you love. The police scanner crackled with routine chatter as she disappeared into the night. Tomorrow, the riders would begin tearing themselves apart, looking for traitors. Paranoia would seep into their ranks. Trust would erode. And in that chaos, she would strike again. But for now, Sarah found herself at Jack's grave. Her tactical gear traded for civilian clothes. The marble headstone reflected moonlight as she traced his name with trembling fingers. "I had to do it," she whispered. "Had to become the Wraith again. But I'm scared, Jack. Not of them. Not of dying. I'm scared of how easy it was to go back. To become that person again." The night wind whispered through the trees, carrying the distant sound of motorcycles. Sarah straightened, squaring her shoulders. The time for doubt was over. She'd made her choice when she pulled that trigger. The Wraith was back, and the demon riders were about to learn why that call sign had once made hardened terrorists wake, screaming in the night. The demon riders' compound was in chaos. From her observation post, Sarah watched through high-powered optics as Buck paced the courtyard, screaming at his assembled men. Miller's death had hit them harder than expected. Not just the loss of an enforcer, but the suggestion of betrayal from within. "Someone's playing us," Buck's voice carried across the distance. "First the supply trucks, now Miller. I want every inch of this county turned upside down until we find out who." Sarah's earpiece crackled with Sheriff Tom's encrypted transmission. "They're losing it, Sarah. 3 businesses got hit this morning. The riders are shaking down everyone, looking for information. It's getting ugly." "Expected response," she replied, noting how the gang's disciplined military structure was already showing cracks. "They're reactive, emotional, making mistakes. They nearly killed old Pete at the hardware store. This is exactly what you wanted, isn't it? Them lashing out, terrorizing innocents?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Sometimes you have to let the infection surface before you can treat it." "Trust me, Tom." The truth was, the civilian casualties weighed on her. Each brutal interrogation, each beating administered by panicked riders, was ultimately her responsibility. But she'd learned in Spec Ops that sometimes the path to saving lives led through darkness. Back in her cabin, Sarah updated her intelligence wall. The rider's response pattern was textbook: increasing violence, tightening internal security, desperately seeking the invisible enemy. They doubled their guards, changed their routes, started varying their schedules, all useless against an opponent who'd written the book on asymmetric warfare. Her burner phone vibrated. Another text from Charlie. "Package received. Buyer. Very interested. Meeting set." Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. While the riders hunted shadows, she'd been busy putting other pieces in place. Their stolen drug shipment was about to be found by their biggest rivals, the Steel Kings MC. By tomorrow, the Kings would think the riders were moving against them, weakened and ready for takeover. Let them tear each other apart. Her laptop chimed with an alert. One of her surveillance devices had picked up a crucial transmission, which got confirmation. Widow's body wasn't in the farm ruins. Boss wants answers. So they finally figured it out. Sarah checked her watch. Right on schedule. The police scanner erupted with reports of gunfire at May's general store. Sarah was moving before the first. Call finished, her gear already prepped. She'd known the riders would eventually target May, thinking she might know something about the widow's survival. Sarah's motorcycle ate up the back roads as she raced toward town. This was the problem with psychological warfare. Civilians always got caught in the crossfire. She'd factored this into her plans, set up contingencies, but the reality of it still tasted bitter. Through her earpiece, she heard Tom coordinating, his trusted deputies, keeping them clear of what was about to happen. Good man. He understood that sometimes justice couldn't come through official channels. May's store came into view, 3 riders' bikes parked haphazardly out front. Sarah ditched her motorcycle in the trees, moving into position with practiced silence. Through her thermal scope, she counted 4 heat signatures inside. 3 riders, 1 civilian pressed against the wall. "Just tell us what you know about the Mitchell woman." A rider's voice, strained with fear and anger. "You helped her escape, didn't you?" May's response was pure steel. "Sarah died in that fire, and if she didn't, I hope she comes back and burns." "You all to hell!" The sound of a slap, then a pained cry. Sarah had heard enough. Time to add another ghost story to the rider's growing collection of nightmares. The first rider died silently, a garrote ending his watch at the back door. The second had just enough time to register movement in his peripheral vision before darkness claimed him. The third, the one holding May, spun at the sounds of bodies falling. "What the fuck?" His words ended in a gurgle as Sarah's knife found his throat with surgical precision. May stared wide-eyed as her attacker crumpled. "Sarah," she whispered. "My God, get in your car. Drive to Sheriff Tom's house. Don't stop for anyone." Sarah's voice was professionally flat as she began arranging the bodies, creating a scene of internal conflict gone wrong. "You never saw me." May nodded, still shaking. "Make them pay. Make them all pay." After May left, Sarah surveyed her work. 3 more traitors in Buck's ranks. 3 more cracks in the rider's foundation. By nightfall, the gang would be eating itself alive with suspicion, seeing betrayal in every shadow. But as she melted back into the darkness, Sarah felt the weight of escalation. The riders would retaliate harder now, desperately trying to maintain control. More innocents would suffer before this was over. "The hardest choices," she whispered Jack's words into the night. "The right choices." Behind her, May's store stood silent, 3 motorcycles waiting for riders who would never return. Above them, storm clouds gathered, promising violence to come. Buck's face filled Sarah's laptop screen, his complexion red with rage as he addressed his diminishing inner circle. Her hidden cameras in the compound's meeting room captured every detail of the gang's unraveling. 4 dead in 3 days. Buck slammed his fist on the table. "Miller, Thompson, the guys at the store. Someone's hunting us, and now the Steel Kings are sniffing around our territory, thinking we're weak." Sarah logged another entry in her mission journal documenting the Riders' deteriorating command structure. Their once disciplined operation was falling apart exactly as planned. Fear had replaced confidence. Paranoia poisoned trust. Her encrypted phone lit up with a message from one of her old SEAL contacts. "Steel Kings took the bait. Moving on rider territory tonight. Full force. Perfect. A gang war would further destabilize the riders, force them to divide their attention. But first, she had another target to eliminate. The riders' main drug lab operated out of an abandoned fertilizer plant, processing meth and cutting heroin for distribution. Sarah had observed their security patterns for days, noting how sloppiness had crept in as fear stretched their manpower thin. Under the cover of darkness, she moved through their defensive perimeter like a ghost, placing shaped charges at critical points. The demolitions training from her SEAL days felt like muscle memory, calculating blast radiuses, positioning charges for maximum structural damage. Her earpiece crackled. "Sarah?" Tom's voice was tense. "Got word from my deputy. Steel Kings are mobilizing. At least 30 bikes heading this way. It's going to be a bloodbath." "Good." Sarah finished setting her final charge. "Keep your men clear of the highway. This ends tonight. She triggered the charges from a safe distance. The explosions ripped through the quiet night, transforming the lab into a fireball. Secondary explosions, chemicals and stored drugs, turned the inferno into a twisted fireworks display. Riders scrambled from the burning building, their shouts carrying clearly to her position. Through her scope, she watched Buck arrive on scene, his face illuminated by the flames. He was receiving reports, coordinating responses, trying to maintain control. Then the first Steel Kings arrived. The rival gang hit hard and fast, automatic weapons fire cutting through the chaos. The riders, already disorganized from the explosion, struggled to mount an effective defense. Sarah observed through her thermal scope as the two gangs tore into each other. "This is on me," she whispered to herself, counting the bodies falling on both sides. The violence was necessary. These men had chosen their path, but the weight of orchestrating it pressed heavy on her conscience. Her radio scanner picked up frantic communications. The riders were calling in reinforcements from their compound, leaving it vulnerable. Exactly as she'd planned, Sarah mounted her motorcycle, the engine's purr lost in the distant sound of gunfire and explosions. The compound would be minimally defended now. Time to hit their heart. As she rode through the back roads, Sarah's mind drifted to her buds training. The instructors had drilled into them that the key to taking down a larger force wasn't about matching their strength. It was about systematic destruction of their infrastructure, their confidence, their will to fight. The riders had thought their greatest asset was fear, but true fear, the kind that destroys organizations from within, came from uncertainty, from knowing that death could come at any moment, from any shadow. She parked her bike in the tree line near the compound. Only 4 guards remained, all focused on the distant firefight. They never saw the shadow that moved among them, never had. Time to raise the alarm. Inside Buck's office, Sarah found what she was looking for: laptops containing financial records, blackmail material, proof of their political connections. She downloaded everything, then planted incriminating evidence linking the gang's leadership to federal crimes. An anonymous tip to the FBI would ensure that even if some riders survived tonight, their organization would never recover. As she finished her work, a familiar voice came through her earpiece. "Sarah?" Tom sounded shaken. "It's a war zone out here. Buck's dead. Steel Kings got him in the first wave. What's left of both gangs is scattered, fighting across 3 counties. And the civilians? Safe. My deputies evacuated the likely battle areas when we saw the Kings mobilizing. But Sarah, this is bigger than anything I can cover up. It's supposed to be." Sarah planted her final surprise in the compound's ammunition storage. By morning, there won't be anything left to cover up. She rode away as the compound erupted behind her, carrying with her the evidence that would dismantle what remained of the riders' empire. In a single night, she'd orchestrated the destruction of 2 criminal organizations using their own violence. Against them, the night sky glowed orange with distant fires as Sarah made her way back to her cabin. Tomorrow, federal agents would swarm the area, following her anonymous tips. The few surviving riders would face a choice: prison or witness. Protection. But tonight wasn't about tomorrow. Tonight was about justice, served cold by a ghost they should never have awakened. The encrypted files from Buck's laptop painted a picture far darker than Sarah had anticipated. In her cabin, surrounded by multiple screens displaying financial records and email chains, she traced the threads of corruption that ran through every level of local government. Judge Reynolds wasn't just taking bribes. He was the architect of the entire operation. The Demon Riders were his enforcers, their violence carefully directed to benefit his real estate schemes. Every burned-out farm, every terrorized business had been strategically chosen to depress property values. "You seeing this, Tom?" Sarah, spoke into her encrypted line. Jesus, the sheriff's voice was heavy. Reynolds has been buying up everything through shell companies. The riders burn people out, his companies acquire the land for pennies, then mysterious developers swoop in with multi-million-dollar projects. Sarah opened another file, this one containing surveillance photos. He's got half the county commission in his pocket. State police commanders, federal prosecutors, they're all on his payroll. That's why we could never touch them. Tom's bitter laugh crackled through the speaker. The whole system's rigged. A message notification blinked on her screen. Charlie had come through again. Got something you need to see. Meet at usual place. The usual place was a defunct ranger station deep in the national forest. Sarah found Charlie waiting inside, his former SEAL bearing still evident despite his civilian clothes. He handed her a thick folder without preamble. Your judge friend? He's got connections way above his pay grade, federal level. Remember that classified operation in Paraguay that went sideways in 19? Sarah's blood ran cold. That mission had been completely off books, a shadow war that officially never happened. How deep? Reynolds was CIA back then, handled money laundering for certain enhanced interrogation programs, made himself a fortune and a lot of friends in high places. Charlie lit a cigarette. When he retired, he brought his playbook here. The riders aren't just a gang, they're his private army. Back at her cabin, Sarah expanded her intelligence wall. The pattern was familiar. She'd seen similar operations in failed states and war zones. Reynolds had taken lessons learned from destabilizing foreign regions and applied them domestically. Her police scanner squawked with increasing reports of violence. The power vacuum left by the riders' collapse had drawn in other criminal elements. Reynolds wouldn't let his empire crumble without a fight. A knock at her door, the special pattern that identified Tom. He entered looking haggard, his uniform stained with smoke. 3 more fires in the county, he reported. Not random. Reynolds is cleaning house, destroying evidence. I've got 2 dead witnesses who were ready to talk to the feds. Sarah nodded grimly. He's reverting to CIA tactics. Scorched earth. She pointed to her wall of evidence. But he made one mistake. He kept records of everything. That's not like him. No. Sarah's eyes narrowed. He wanted a fail-safe, insurance against his partners turning on him, which means there's copies somewhere, Tom finished. A dead man's switch. Sarah turned to her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Reynolds had been CIA. He'd think like an operative. The dead man's switch would be automated, tied to secure servers, there, hidden in the code of a local news website. A countdown ticking away. If Reynolds didn't enter a code every 48 hours, everything would be exposed. That's why he's burning. It all, Sarah muttered. He's getting ready to run. Once he's safe, he'll let the switch trigger, burning everyone else to cover his tracks. Tom studied the evidence wall. Even with all this, he's got too many friends in high places. He'll walk away clean. No. Sarah's voice was steel. He won't. She opened her weapons cache, selecting equipment with practiced efficiency. Reynolds had learned the CIA's methods of destabilizing regions, but Sarah had learned something else in her years of service. How to hunt men who thought themselves untouchable. What's the play? Tom asked, recognizing the look in her eyes. Reynolds thinks like an operative, but he's been civilian too long. He'll have a bolt hole. Somewhere familiar, defensible. Not his beach house in Florida or his ranch in Montana. Those are too obvious. Sarah pulled up property records, cross-referencing shell companies and dummy corporations. There, hunting lodge in the mountains, bought through 7 layers of corporations, stocked regularly with supplies. He's been preparing for this. You're going after a former CIA officer on his home turf. Sarah checked her modified M4, each movement precise. He's got training, but he's been behind a desk for 15 years? I've spent that time in the field. As she geared up, Sarah's mind was already gaming out scenarios, planning angles of approach, identifying likely security measures. Reynolds might have learned how to destabilize regions, but she had learned something far more valuable. How to be the ghost that haunts powerful men's nightmares. The rain had started an hour ago, turning the mountain roads treacherous as Sarah made her final preparations. Her sat phone lit up with an urgent message from Tom. Reynolds knows. He's activated his security team. Professional contractors, ex-military, at least dozen men at the lodge. Sarah studied the topographical map of the area surrounding Reynolds's hunting lodge, marking likely observation posts and patrol routes. The judge had chosen his ground well, clear lines of sight, minimal approach vectors, natural bottlenecks, but he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd chosen terrain perfect for defending against an assault team. Sarah wasn't planning an assault, she was hunting. The first warning shot caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her behind a tree. Ceramic plate took most of the impact, but the message was clear. Reynolds' men were better than expected. That was your warning. A professional voice called out. Next one goes through your head. Stand down and walk away. This isn't your fight anymore. Sarah touched her earpiece. Tom, you copy? Here. You hit? Plate caught it. Reynolds' security team found my forward observation post. They're good. She checked her gear, mind already adapting plans. Keep monitoring police. Bands. If Reynolds tries to call in local support, delay them. The security team was moving through the woods with professional precision, trying to flank her position. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. They were good, but they were used to operating as a team. She'd spent years learning to be a ghost. Rain intensified, reducing visibility. Sarah moved like water through the underbrush, placing her charges at key points. Not to kill, she needed intel from these men, but to control the battlefield. The first explosion sent two contractors scrambling for cover. The second and third, detonating seconds later, created chaos in their formation. Sarah was moving. Before the echoes died, striking from angles they couldn't cover, the first contractor went down to a precisely placed shot to his femoral artery. Non-lethal, but he'd be occupied with self-aid. The second never saw her. A knife strike to the brachial nerve cluster left his right arm useless. She's hunting us, one of them shouted into his radio. Delta-level operator, maybe CAG. Sarah's lips twisted. They were trying to build a profile, understand their opponent. But she'd been trained to be unpredictable, to never establish patterns. That could be analyzed. A burst of gunfire forced her to ground. They'd adapted quickly, using overlapping fields of fire to limit her movement. Professional, disciplined. But she could hear the edge of fear in their radio chatter. Tom, she whispered, into her comm. Status on Reynolds, still in the lodge. Getting reports of a helicopter inbound. Looks like he's prepping to bug out. Sarah checked her watch. The dead man's switch would trigger in less than 12 hours. Reynolds would want to be clear of the blast radius when everything burned. Movement. To her left, two contractors trying to push through her flanking position. Sarah triggered her next surprise. Flashbangs and CS gas, a combination that sent them staggering back, breaking their containment. She was through the gap before their vision cleared, leaving more disabled bodies in her wake. Their formation was fracturing, communication breaking. Down as fear took hold. What the hell is she? Can't pin her down. Jenkins is down. Martinez isn't responding. Sarah reached her final position, overlooking the lodge. Through her scope, she could see Reynolds pacing inside, shouting into a satellite phone. 4 contractors remained, pulled back to defensive positions around the building. Her earpiece crackled. Sarah, Tom's voice was urgent. State police just got a call. Reynolds reported a terrorist attack. QRF is spinning up. ETA 30 minutes. Won't matter. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition. This ends now. The rain drummed against her hood as she sighted in on the lodge's generator. One shot and darkness consumed the building. Emergency. Lights kicked in, but she was already moving. The remaining security team never had a chance. She came at them like a force of nature, years of training expressed through perfect violence. When it was over, 12 of Reynolds' best lay scattered through the woods, alive, but thoroughly convinced that they'd face something supernatural. Sarah stood at the lodge's front door, her shadow cast long by the emergency lights. Inside, she could hear Reynolds barricading himself in his panic room. He'd learned CIA tactics, knew how to destabilize regions and manipulate power. But Sarah had learned something far more terrifying in her years as a SEAL: how to become the darkness that powerful men fear. She chambered around, the sound echoing. Through the rain-soaked night, time to teach the judge about true justice. Sarah's boot kicked in the panic room door with calculated force, only to find the reinforced chamber empty. A hidden exit. She should have known Reynolds would have a backup plan. But the surprise that stopped her cold was the voice behind her. "That's far enough, Sarah." Tom's familiar drawl carried none of its usual warmth. She turned slowly, tactical mind cataloguing details. His stance, professional, weight-balanced, his grip on the service weapon, experienced, no shake, the look in his eyes, cold, determined. "How long?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Since before Jack died." Tom kept his distance, respecting her capabilities. "The car accident wasn't random. He was getting too close, asking too many questions about Reynolds' real estate deals." The revelation hit like physical pain, but Sarah's voice remained steady. "You killed my husband." "Arranged it. Reynolds' people handled the actual work. I just made sure the investigation went nowhere." His free hand moved to his radio. "Judge, we're clear. She's contained." Reynolds emerged from the hidden passage, straightening his expensive suit. 2 more armed men flanked him, not contractors, but the kind of professionals who didn't exist on any payroll. "I must admit, Sarah, you've impressed me." Reynolds smiled like a satisfied teacher. "When Tom told me about your background, I didn't quite believe it. One woman dismantling my entire operation. But you've proven quite spectacular." Sarah's mind raced through options, calculating angles, weapons within reach, available cover. But Tom knew her capabilities. He'd positioned himself perfectly to limit her movements. "Why tell me now?" she asked, buying time, looking for openings. "You could have shot me when I breached the room." "Because I'm offering you a job." Reynolds spread his hands. Clearly the demon riders were too crude, too undisciplined. "I need someone with your skills, your understanding of systematic dismantling, of power structures. Together, we could expand this operation nationwide." "Like you did in Paraguay?" The question made Reynolds' eyes sharpen. "Oh yes, I know all about your CIA days, the destabilization campaigns, the black sites, the fortune you built on human suffering." Tom's radio crackled. "QRF 5 minutes out." "Sir, last chance, Sarah." Reynolds' smile faded. "Join us or join Jack? Your choice." Sarah let her shoulders slump, defeat entering her posture. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "I do understand systematic dismantling." The explosion that rocked the lodge came from below, the charges she'd planted during her initial recon when she'd first discovered the escape tunnel. As the floor gave way, Sarah was already moving, her surrender having pulled Tom slightly. Out of position, her first throw sent a flashbang into Reynolds' security detail. The second, a move Tom had never seen her practice, dropped a smoke grenade perfectly between them. In the chaos, Sarah became what she'd always been, a ghost in the darkness. Gunfire erupted blind, the men shooting at shadows while Sarah moved among them like death itself. When the smoke cleared, Reynolds' men lay groaning or unconscious. Tom was nowhere to be seen. Wounded or escaped, she couldn't be sure, but Reynolds himself remained, pinned under debris from the explosion, his expensive suit covered in dust and blood. His calm facade had cracked, revealing the fear beneath. "The QRF," he gasped. "They'll be here any minute. You'll never escape." Sarah checked her watch and smiled. "You mean the State Police Quick Reaction Force? Check your phone, Judge. They're a bit busy with all the evidence of your operation. I just uploaded to their servers. Turns out your dead man's switch worked. Both ways. I used its connection to backtrack into your secure files." Reynolds' face went pale. "Impossible. Those servers were CIA-grade secure. And I was a SEAL who specialized in cyber operations before going into wet work. You're not the only one with a past, Judge." Sarah zip-tied his hands. "Tom gave you my background, but you didn't really understand what it meant. I wasn't just any SEAL. I was the one they sent in when they needed entire organizations to disappear." In the distance, sirens wailed, but not QRF. Regular police, FBI, multiple agencies converging. Sarah's anonymous tips had found fertile ground once she'd provided access to Reynolds' files. "They'll never prosecute me," Reynolds spat. "I know too much. One phone call." "To whom?" Sarah's smile was terrible. "The same people who just received proof that you've been running unauthorized operations on U.S. soil, using CIA tactics against American citizens. Even your old friends won't touch you now. You're radioactive." She left him there, zip-tied, and raging as the sound of law enforcement grew closer. But she had one piece of business left. Tom was out there somewhere, wounded but alive. The man who'd pretended to be Jack's friend while arranging his murder, who'd played the role of concerned sheriff while helping Reynolds destroy lives. The night wasn't over yet. Blood drops in the rain. Tom was wounded, trying to make it to his backup vehicle. Sarah tracked him through the darkness, her mind replaying years of false friendship. Every sympathetic word after Jack's death, every show of support, had been a calculated lie. The trail led down the mountain service road. Tom was moving smart, using terrain to break line of sight, but he was leaving signs only a trained operator would recognize. He wanted her to follow. "You're slipping, Tom," she whispered to herself, noting the too obvious scuff marks, the broken branches. "Making it too easy." Her instincts screamed ambush just as the first shot cracked past her head. Sarah dove for cover as more rounds impacted around her. Tom's voice carried through the rain. "Taught you everything I know about police work, Sarah, but you never asked where I learned it." His voice came from multiple directions. He'd set up speakers, trying to mask his location. "Delta Force 95-04. Reynolds recruited me straight after discharge." Sarah moved silently through the underbrush, piecing it together. "You were his advance man, setting up operations in new territories." "Give the lady a prize." Tom's laugh was bitter. "I'd scope out vulnerable communities, identify pressure points, corrupt the right officials. The riders were just the muscle. I was the real architect of Reynolds' expansion." A bullet splintered the tree next to Sarah. Tom was good, using the rain and darkness to hide his muzzle flash, changing positions between shots. But Sarah had learned to hunt in environments far worse than this. "You know what your mistake was, Sarah," Tom continued, trying to keep her distracted. "You got sloppy, personal. The Sarah Mitchell I read about in classified files would never have let emotion drive her decisions." "That's where you're wrong." Sarah's voice echoed from the darkness. "Emotion didn't make me sloppy. It made me focused." She triggered the last of her prepared charges, not where Tom was, but where he would go. The explosion drove him exactly where she wanted him, his training making him react in predictable ways. "You forgot the first rule they teach you in special operations," Sarah said, materializing behind him like a ghost. "Never assume you're the smartest one in the fight." Tom spun, weapon raising, but Sarah was already inside his guard. The fight was brief, brutal, and decisive. When it ended, Tom lay in the mud, his own handcuffs securing him. "Do it," he spat blood. "Finish it like you did the riders." Sarah checked his wounds. Painful, but not fatal. No, death would be too easy. "You're going to live, Tom. Live to see everything you built torn down. Live to testify about Reynolds' operation, about Jack's murder, about all of it. They'll kill me in prison." "Maybe." Sarah retrieved a satellite phone from her gear. "But that's not my problem. See, the real Sarah Mitchell, the one you read about in those files, she understood something you never did. True revenge isn't about killing, it's about justice." Red and blue lights began painting the trees as federal vehicles approached the lodge. Sarah's anonymous tips had done their work. Multiple agencies converging on Reynolds' operation with enough evidence to bury everyone involved. One last thing. Sarah knelt beside Tom. "Jack suspected, didn't he? That's why you had to move against him." Tom's silence was answer enough. "He was a better person than me." Sarah stood, checking her exfil route. "He believed in the system, in doing things the right way. But I'm what you made me, Tom, the widow who became a weapon. Remember that in prison." She disappeared into the rain as the first federal agents reached Tom's position. Her part in this was done. Reynolds would face justice, his empire dismantled, his corrupt network exposed. Tom would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder in federal prison. And Sarah? She had one last piece of business, one final mission to complete. It was time to go home. The FBI's raid on Reynolds' operation had sparked a wildfire of investigations across 3 states. Sarah watched from the shadows as her carefully planted evidence bore fruit, each revelation triggering another round of arrests. But she knew it wasn't over. Reynolds had one last card to play. Her laptop illuminated the cabin's interior as she monitored encrypted communications. Reynolds' CIA contacts were scrambling, trying to contain the damage. A black ops team was being assembled, not to rescue him, but to silence him before he could expose decades of illegal operations. Sarah's burner phone lit up with a message from Charlie. "Cleanup crew incoming. Professional ghosts. They'll hit the federal detention center at dawn." She studied the facility's schematics, already plotting angles of approach. Reynolds had to survive to face justice, not just for her, but for every life his corruption had destroyed. The CIA team wouldn't expect resistance. They'd never imagined that someone like her would be waiting. "You don't have to do this," Charlie's voice crackled through her sat phone. "You've won. Reynolds is finished. Tom's singing like a bird to the feds. Walk away." Sarah checked her weapons with practiced precision. "Can't. As long as Reynolds is alive, his old friends will try to tie up loose ends. Someone has to make sure justice happens in the light." The Sarah Mitchell I knew died in that fire. No. She loaded magazines with mechanical efficiency. The Sarah Mitchell who hid behind a peaceful life died in that fire. The Wraith, she's back. The detention center's security was impressive. Multiple layers of armed guards, electronic surveillance, biometric locks. But Sarah had spent her career breaching more heavily defended targets. By midnight, she'd identified the weak points, mapped the patrol patterns, calculated response times. Her encrypted laptop chimed with an alert. The CIA team was on the move, 12 operators, top-tier equipment, arriving in unmarked vehicles. They'd pose as federal marshals, using credentials that would pass any normal inspection. Sarah moved like a shadow through the facility's blind spots, placing sensors and specialized charges. Not to kill, these men were just following orders, but to deny access, to channel them into prepared zones of control. The first CIA vehicle arrived at 0300 hours. Sarah watched through her thermal scope as 4 operators deployed, their movement patterns confirming her suspicions. These were elite ghosts, The kind of operators who officially didn't exist, just like Kazakhstan, she whispered to herself, remembering a similar operation from her SEAL days. The difference was, this time she was the defender, not the infiltrator. Her. Phone vibrated. A text from one of her old contacts inside the FBI. Reynolds talking. Big names. They're moving him to secure facility at 0600. 3 hours. She had to hold the CIA team back for 3 hours, keep Reynolds alive long enough to expose everything. The rain had stopped, but thunder still rolled in the distance. A storm was coming. Sarah activated her comms, tapping into the CIA team's encrypted frequency. Their voices painted a picture of professional killers, moving with precise coordination. They had no idea they were being hunted. Alpha team in position. Bravo, move into East Entrance. A Charlie team has override codes for security system. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile, everything proceeding exactly as she'd predicted. The CIA's playbook hadn't changed since her active duty days, which meant she knew exactly how to disrupt. The first charge detonated at 031 turning the facility's east parking lot into a chaos of smoke and strobing lights. The CIA team reacted with professional precision, splitting forces to cover multiple approaches, exactly as she'd planned. Thunder rolled closer as Sarah readied herself for the fight ahead. These men were the best of the best, trained to eliminate targets that officially never existed, but they were about to learn what the Demon Riders had learned too late. Some ghosts are better left unavenged. The CIA team's first casualties came at 0327 hours. Sarah's non-lethal traps separated 4 operators from their unit, leaving them unconscious in strategically inconvenient positions. The team leader's voice crackled with the first edge of concern. All units switch to pattern Delta. We've got interference. Professional. Sarah moved through the facility's maintenance corridors, placing her final charges. The CIA team was adapting quickly, changing formations to counter an unknown threat. But they were still thinking linearly, clear the facility, reach Reynolds, eliminate the target. They hadn't realized they were being herded. Her earpiece picked up their encrypted chatter. Charlie team, no joy on East Access. Bravo, reporting. Resistance at North Entrance. Multiple devices found, military grade. Someone knew we were coming. The facility's regular guards were huddled in their break room, zip-tied and unconscious. Sarah's first priority when she infiltrated. No casualties, no witnesses. The CIA team would have killed them without hesitation. The difference between professionals and ghosts. Ghosts could afford conscience. For 2 hours. Her motion sensors showed the remaining CIA operators regrouping, consolidating their forces for a direct push. Smart, but predictable. They'd lost their timeline advantage, and now they were falling back on brute force. Sarah's fingers flew across her laptop, accessing the facility's systems through back doors she'd installed hours ago. The CIA team had override codes, but she had something better. Direct hardware access to the security network. Alpha Actual, we've lost camera feeds. Backup systems compromised. Someone's inside the network. Push forward all units. Clock's running. They were right about the clock. Every minute brought them closer to Reynolds' transfer, closer to his testimony going public. Sarah could feel the shift in their tactics. Desperation creeping in, making them aggressive. 6 hours. The CIA team breached the inner security corridor, moving with the fluid precision of elite operators. Sarah watched through her thermal scope as they cleared rooms with textbook efficiency. 8 operators remained, all veterans of black operations. That officially never happened. Her throw took them by surprise, not a flashbang, but something from her own kit. Custom-made smoke combining tear gas with proprietary compounds. Their gear would filter most of it, but the psychological impact was immediate. These men were used to being the unseen threat, not the hunted. Contact front, unknown agent. Cannot Confirm target location. Systems compromised. We're blind. Sarah's voice, electronically distorted, echoed through the corridor. Final warning. Reynolds lives to testify. Walk away. Their response was professional and immediate, concentrated fire at her last known position. But she was already gone, moving through maintenance shafts and hidden passages. The facility's blueprints had shown her paths that didn't officially exist. So 5 hours. Less than 2 hours until Reynolds' transfer. The CIA team had reached the cell block security station, but Sarah had prepared a special welcome. As they breached the door, UV lights flooded the area, revealing hundreds of nearly invisible strings, crisscrossing the space. Tripwires. Jesus Christ, one operator breathed. This whole place is rigged. Who the hell are we up against? Doesn't matter, push through, remember the mission. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. They still didn't understand. This wasn't about stopping them from reaching Reynolds. This was about keeping them occupied, bleeding their time away in a maze of her creation. The thunder outside grew closer as Sarah made her final preparations. The CIA team had adapted well, shown impressive resilience, but they'd made one critical mistake. They assumed she was trying to win the fight. She wasn't. She was trying to win the war. For 5 hours. Through her thermal scope, Sarah watched the CIA team make their final push toward Reynolds' cell. They moved like apex predators, every step calculated, every angle covered. But their earlier confidence had been replaced by something else, something that elite operators rarely experienced. Fear, not of death. These men had made peace with mortality long ago. They feared something worse, failure. The kind of failure that left loose ends, that unraveled decades of secret operations, that exposed the machinery of shadow wars to public light. Sarah checked her watch one last time. The CIA team had finally reached their objective, exactly where she wanted them. Now came the hard part. Now came the ghost. The CIA team breached Reynolds' cell block at precisely 0500 hours. Their formation tight despite hours of psychological warfare. The last 8 operators moved like a single organism, hardened by years of black ops. But Sarah could see the strain in their movements, the heightened awareness of men who knew they were being hunted. Cell block clear, the team leader whispered. Target located, moving to extract. Reynolds sat on his bunk, oddly calm as elite killers filled his cell. Took you long enough. Complications, the leader growled. Someone knew we were coming, the widow. Reynolds' smile was knowing. I tried to recruit her, you know. Imagine what we could have done with an operator of her caliber. Sarah's voice echoed through the cell block. You still don't understand what you're dealing with. Her words came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off concrete walls. This was never about recruitment. This was about justice. The CIA team snapped into defensive positions, weapons tracking shadows. Their infrared gear was useless. Sarah had flooded the area with thermal scramblers, technology even they hadn't seen before. Ghost team, protect the target. The leader's voice carried an edge of fear now. Fall back to exit point Alpha. No one's leaving. Sarah's words were ice. Reynolds testifies in 1 hour. Everything burns in the light. The first attack came from above, Sarah dropping from a maintenance shaft like an avenging angel. 2 operators went down before they could track her movement, non-lethal strikes leaving them unconscious. She vanished again as the team opened fire, their disciplined bursts hitting nothing but air. She's playing with us, one operator hissed. Using our own tactics against us. Shut up and move. The leader pushed Reynolds toward the exit. 4-man box around the target. Sarah's next strike came from below, a section of floor that shouldn't have opened, hands that grabbed ankles and pulled. 3 more operators disappeared into the darkness with startled shouts. The remaining 3 formed a triangle around. Reynolds backs together, watching all angles. You know what your mistake was? Sarah's voice seemed to come from the walls themselves. You thought because you operate in shadows, You understand the dark. But you don't live there, not like I did. Thunder crashed outside as the facility's power died. Emergency lights cast crimson shadows as Sarah emerged like a wraith, her movements liquid grace. The team leader fired first, precise shots that would have killed a normal operator. But Sarah was already gone, the bullets passing through. Where she had been, "You're good," she acknowledged, her voice now behind them. "But I was trained to hunt things worse than you." The next 30 seconds were a symphony of violence. Sarah moved through the CIA team like smoke, her strikes precise and devastating. These men were elite operators, the best their agency could. A field, but she was something else entirely. A ghost made flesh, vengeance given form. When it ended, 7 of the world's deadliest operators lay unconscious on cold concrete. Only the team leader remained, standing between Sarah and Reynolds. "Wait," he lowered his weapon slightly. "I know that move set. Paraguay, 2019. The cartel extraction that officially never happened. That was you. The mission that Reynolds corrupted?" Sarah stepped into the red emergency light. "Yes, I was there when he turned a rescue operation into a money laundering scheme. When he got good men killed for profit." Jesus Christ. The leader's weapon wavered. "You're the Wraith. They said you died in action." "I did." Sarah's smile was terrible. "The woman who believed in the system died in Paraguay. What came back was something else." Reynolds tried to bolt, but Sarah's throw dropped him with clinical precision. The team leader made no move to stop her. "He has to survive," the leader said quietly. "Orders. He will." Sarah zip-tied Reynolds with professional efficiency. "He's going to live a long life in federal custody, testifying about every operation he corrupted, every life he destroyed. That's a fate worse than death for men like him." The leader nodded slowly, understanding. "We were never here." "No, you weren't." Sarah's voice held cold certainty. "But I'll be watching. If anyone tries to silence him, if any accident befalls him in custody, I'll come out of retirement again. And next time, I won't be so gentle." Dawn was breaking as federal marshals arrived for Reynolds' transfer. They found him secured and ready, surrounded by unconscious CIA operators who would be gone before anyone could identify them. The official report would show no signs of Sarah's presence, just another ghost story in a career full of them. But Reynolds knew. As they led him to the transport vehicle, his eyes darted to every shadow, every dark corner. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if the Wraith was watching, waiting. And she would be. Some ghosts never truly rest. 2 months after Reynolds' arrest, Sarah stood in the ashes of her farm. Spring rain had washed away the scorch marks, and green shoots were already pushing through the blackened soil. Nature, like justice, found its way even in the darkest places. The federal investigation had exposed everything. Reynolds' corruption, the CIA's illegal domestic operations, Tom's network of compromised officials. Dozens of arrests across 3 states, with more coming as Reynolds continued his testimony. The Demon Riders were finished, their surviving members scattered to the winds. May from the general store approached cautiously, carrying a basket of fresh bread and vegetables. The whole community had watched the news unfold, piecing together the truth about the quiet widow who had lived among them. "We're rebuilding the Anderson place next week," May said, setting down the basket. "Whole. A town's pitching in. Your farm's next if you want it." Sarah knelt, touching the fertile soil that had given her peace after Jack's death. "I'm not sure I can go back to being just a farmer." "Who said anything about just a farmer?" May's voice held knowing warmth. "This town needs protectors, Sarah. People who understand that peace isn't the absence of evil, but the strength to face it." In the distance, Sarah's trained ear caught the sound of motorcycles. Not riders this time, but normal people going about their lives. The fear that had gripped the community was fading, replaced by something stronger: resilience. Her satellite phone vibrated, Charlie with another mission request. Somewhere else, another community needed a ghost to fight its shadows. But for the first time since Jack's death, Sarah felt the pull of home, of putting down roots in soil, stained with both blood and hope. Besides, May continued, I hear the FBI's setting up a rural task force in the county. They could use someone who knows the territory, someone who understands how corruption takes hold and how to fight it. Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her hands. The warrior and the widow, she realized, had never been separate people. They were both part of who she was, the protector, the farmer, the ghost who had found her way home. First things first, she said, allowing herself a small smile. This farm needs rebuilding. As if in answer, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the scorched earth in colors of renewal. Sarah Mitchell, widow, warrior, protector, stood in its warmth, feeling the weight of her choices settle into something. Like peace, some ghosts never rest, but sometimes they find new purpose in the light.